They were testing radar over one of the most closely watched spots on the ranch. What showed up on screen wasn't part of the plan. If your equipment picked up something unplanned mid-experiment, would you keep recording or shut it down? And for everyone watching tonight, where in the world are you tuning in from? Stick around, because this one is still unfolding in real time. And there's a lot worth understanding before we get to what actually happened this week. Before diving into the newest development, it's worth being upfront about something. This recap is based on real, currently airing content from Season 7 of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch on History Channel, specifically the episode that aired this week under the Behind the Gates banner titled Something in the Air. What's confirmed publicly at this point is that the team ran a drone and radar experiment centered on one of the property's most heavily studied anomalies, and that a surprising sighting added an unexpected twist to that experiment. What hasn't been published yet in any outlet covering the episode is a detailed description of exactly what that sighting was. This aired only days ago, and detailed recaps describing the specific visual content of the sighting simply haven't caught up yet. So rather than invent details that haven't been confirmed, this recap is going to do something a little different. It's going to walk through exactly what is confirmed, build the full context around why this moment matters as much as it does, and be honest about where the confirmed information currently ends. That kind of honesty matters more than it might seem, especially with a show like this one, which has spent years building a reputation based on the credibility of its data rather than the theatrics of its claims. So let's start with what we actually know and build outward from there. Before getting into this week's specific development, it helps to understand the broader arc of this property's investigation, because this week's sighting doesn't exist in isolation. It's the latest entry in a documented history that stretches back decades, long before any camera crew ever set foot on the land. The property sits in Utah's Uinta Basin, a 512-acre stretch of high desert that has carried a reputation for unusual activity for far longer than any formal scientific investigation has existed to study it. Long before the current ownership group or any television production became involved, local ranching families in the area had already compiled decades of first-hand accounts describing unexplained lights, unusual animal behavior, and encounters they struggled to categorize using any conventional framework. Those accounts eventually attracted the attention of private research organizations interested in unexplained aerial phenomena. And over time, the property transitioned from a working ranch with an unusual local reputation into one of the most formally studied pieces of private land in the country when it comes to unexplained phenomena. That transition matters for understanding why a show like this one carries more credibility with a certain segment of its audience than typical paranormal programming tends to. This isn't a production that arrived at an arbitrary location and simply declared it mysterious for the cameras. It's a production built around an already decades documented site with a substantial body of prior investigation, formal and informal, that predates the show itself by years. The current ownership group has spent significant resources assembling a team of credentialed scientists, engineers, and researchers specifically to bring a more rigorous, instrumentation-heavy approach to a set of phenomena that had previously been documented, mostly through anecdote. That's the context that makes this week's episode meaningful in a way that goes beyond a single strange sighting. It's not an isolated incident happening to an unremarkable location. It's the newest entry in a long cumulative record of anomalies tied to a property whose reputation for producing exactly this kind of unexplained event predates the current investigation by generations. To understand why a moment like this, an unplanned sighting appearing in the middle of a live radar, now in drone experiment, carries real weight, you have to understand the specific anomaly the team was investigating when it happened. For several seasons now, this show has centered a significant portion of its attention on something the team refers to simply as the bubble, a region of the property associated with a consistent pattern of unusual radar returns, equipment interference, and reported sightings that don't line up neatly with conventional explanation. The bubble isn't a single object or a single location in the traditional sense. It's closer to a zone, an area where the already very unusual behavior seems to concentrate and intensify, and where the team has repeatedly returned with increasingly sophisticated instrumentation in an attempt to understand what's actually happening there. Over the course of this season alone, the team has used specialized rocket launch, controlled fire experiments, smoke and laser setups, and now large-scale drone deployments in an effort to map the bubble as precisely as possible. Each of those experiments has been designed to build on the last, adding a new layer of data to a picture the team has been assembling piece by piece across dozens of episodes and multiple years of investigation. That incremental, methodical approach is part of what separates this show from a lot of other paranormal adjacent programming. The team isn't chasing a single dramatic reveal. They're running an actual, if unconventional, scientific investigation, complete with the slow, occasionally tedious accumulation of data that real field work requires. The drone and radar experiment featured in this week's episode fits directly into that pattern. According to what's been publicly described so far, the team deployed drone technology in coordination with radar systems, specifically to study the bubble in more detail than previous experiments had allowed. Drones give the team a perspective that ground-based instruments simply can't provide. The ability to move through three-dimensional space above and around the anomaly, gathering data from angles and altitudes that fixed sensors on the ground would never capture. Pairing that with radar, which has been one of the team's most consistently useful tools for detecting objects and disturbances that aren't visible to the naked eye, gave this particular experiment a much richer data set to work with than a single instrument approach would have produced. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how far the team's technological approach has evolved since these earliest seasons of this investigation. In the show's first years, much of the documentation relied heavily on handheld cameras, basic thermal imaging, and a lot of patient waiting for anything, to happen in front of a lens. Over time, as the investigation secured more resources and the team's understanding of the property's patterns deepened, the toolkit expanded dramatically. Spectrum analyzers, magnetometers, LiDAR scanning equipment, specialized rocketry, and now increasingly sophisticated drone swarms have all been folded into an investigative approach that looks less like a paranormal reality show with each passing season and more like an actual, if unusual, field research operation. That evolution didn't happen all at once, and tracing its progression helps explain why this week's experiment represents such a significant technological milestone for the show. Earlier seasons relied on single drone reconnaissance, typically used to get an aerial view of a specific structure or region after an anomaly had already been reported by someone on the ground. That approach was useful for documentation, but limited. A single drone can only cover so much area, and by the time it's deployed in response to a reported anomaly, whatever triggered the report has often already ended. Later seasons introduced coordinated multi-drone deployments, allowing the team to cover significantly larger areas simultaneously rather than relying on one aircraft moving sequentially across a region. That shift meaningfully increased the odds of catching something in the moment it was actually happening, rather than arriving off after the fact to document only the aftermath. Around the same period, the team began integrating radar more systematically into their standard operating procedure, rather than treating it as a specialized tool reserved for occasional dedicated experiment. Radar's ability to detect objects and disturbance, regardless of lighting conditions, weather, or line of sight limitation, made it a natural complement to visual and thermal imaging, filling in gaps that cameras alone simply couldn't cover. This season has pushed that integration even further, combining drone swarm, radar coverage, and a growing suite of additional instrumentation into single, coordinated experiments, rather than treating each tool as a separate, standalone investigative method. The drone and radar deployment featured in this week's episode represents close to the most advanced version of that integrated approach the show has attempted so far, which is part of why an unplanned sighting occurring during that specific experiment carries so much weight. It didn't happen using the show's earliest, most limited toolkit. It happened using the most sophisticated combination of detection methods the investigation has ever deployed in a single coordinated effort. That evolution matters for understanding this week's sighting because it changes the standard of evidence involved. A strange shape caught on a shaky handheld camera in a show's first season carries a certain kind of weight. Interesting, but easy to dismiss as a trick of light or a compression artifact. A sighting that occurs in the middle of coordinated drone and radar experiment with multiple independent instruments potentially capturing the same event from different angles and using different detection methods carries a very different kind of weight. If something anomalous shows up on radar at the same moment, something is also observed visually. That's not one piece of ambiguous evidence. That's corroboration, the exact kind of overlapping, independently verified data point that serious investigations spend years trying to capture and rarely actually get. This is exactly why, even without a full description of what the sighting actually involved, its context alone makes it significant. It didn't happen in isolation, caught by a single lucky camera angle during downtime. It happened during an active, planned, multi-instrument experiment, specifically designed to detect unusual activity in that part of the property. Whatever showed up, it showed up in front of technology built and deployed specifically to notice it. There's another important piece of context worth including here, and it has to do with who was leading this particular segment of the investigation. According to the available episode information, Matty Blake takes a central role in this installment as he engages directly with the mystery of the bubble. Blake has served as a recurring host and interviewer across the broader Skinwalker Ranch media ecosystem, often functioning as the figure who translates the team's technical findings into a format viewers can follow without needing a background in astrophysics or electrical engineering. His involvement in this episode signals that the events being documented were considered significant enough to warrant that kind of dedicated framing, rather than being treated as a minor aside within a larger episode focused on something else entirely. It's also worth remembering the broader team dynamic this season because it shapes how seriously a moment like this deserves to be taken. Dr. Travis Taylor, an astrophysicist who has been part of this investigation from its earliest days, has built a reputation across the show's run as one of its most consistently skeptical voices. Someone whose default posture toward any new data point is to look for the mundane explanation first and only entertain more extraordinary possibilities once the ordinary ones have been genuinely ruled out. A team that includes that kind of built-in skepticism doesn't get swept up easily by an unexpected reading or a strange shape on a screen. If an event like this week's sighting was significant enough to shape an entire episode and significant enough to warrant continued attention in the show's promotional materials and episode descriptions, that's meaningful in itself, given how consistently this particular team has resisted overselling ambiguous data in the past. Taylor isn't the only team member whose background matters here either. Over the course of the show's run, the investigation has assembled a team that includes engineers, a principal investigator overseeing the property's day-to-day operations, security personnel with background relevant to monitoring a large and remote property, and researchers with expertise spanning fields as varied as anthropology and biology. That range of expertise matters because it means a significant, unplanned event during an experiment doesn't just get evaluated by one person's individual reaction. It gets filtered through a group of people with genuinely different professional backgrounds and different instincts about what counts as noteworthy versus what counts as no. A physicist, an engineer, and a security specialist don't necessarily interpret an ambiguous radar return the same way. When a team with that much internal diversity of expertise collectively treats something as significant enough to build an episode around, that consensus carries more weight than a single individual's excited reaction would on its own. This isn't a team prone to treating every unusual reading as evidence of something extraordinary. Multiple seasons have included moments where the team spent considerable time and effort tracking down a promising anomaly, only to conclude, after thorough investigation, that it had a mundane explanation after all. A malfunctioning sensor, an unusual but explainable atmospheric condition, wildlife behaving in ways that looked stranger on camera than it actually was in person. That willingness to rule things out, even after investing real time and resources chasing them, is part of what gives more weight to the moments the team does continue to treat as significant. This week's sighting falls into that second category, at least based on how it's been framed in the show's own official episode description. Let's talk a little more about the bubble itself, because understanding what makes this specific location on the property so significant helps explain why an unplanned sighting occurring there landed as hard as it did with longtime viewers of the show. Across the show's run, this region has repeatedly produced some of the most difficult to explain data the team has recorded. Earlier seasons documented unusual radar returns in this same general area, readings that didn't correspond to any identifiable area, weather phenomena, or equipment malfunction the team could confirm through standard troubleshooting. Electromagnetic anomalies have also been associated with this part of the property, with instruments occasionally behaving erratically in ways that seem to correlate with proximity to this specific zone rather than occurring randomly across the wider ranch. Over time, as more data accumulated, the bubble became the team's working shorthand for this cluster of overlapping, seemingly connected phenomena, even though a full explanation for what's actually generating them has remained elusive. The naming itself reflects something specific about how the team came to understand this region. Rather than describing it as a single point on a map, the working theory that emerged from years of accumulated data suggested something closer to a defined, roughly bounded field of influence, a zone with edges that could, at least loosely, be mapped, inside which instruments behave differently than they did just outside its boundary. That's a meaningfully different kind of anomaly than a single haunted feeling location. A location with a fixed boundary, one that instrumentation can actually help trace and confirm over repeated visits, is the kind of anomaly a scientific team can actually study systematically rather than simply document anecdotally. Multiple seasons have been dedicated, at least in part, to trying to establish exactly where those boundaries sit and how consistent they are over time. Some experiments have suggested the boundary shifts under certain conditions, expanding or contracting in ways that don't yet correlate cleanly with any single external factor the team has identified. Not time of day, not season, not weather, not any specific activity happening elsewhere on the property that they've been able to isolate as a trigger. That inconsistency has made the bubble one of the most persistently frustrating aspects of the entire investigation for the team, precisely because it resists the kind of clean, repeatable experimental conditions that would make it easier to study using conventional scientific methods. There's a reason that frustration hasn't led the team to abandon the bubble as a focus, even after years of inconclusive results. Unlike a lot of the property's other reported phenomena, which tend to occur unpredictably and without warning, the bubble has at least demonstrated enough consistency to reliably produce unusual instrument readings whenever the team brings sensitive equipment into its general vicinity. That reliability, even without a full explanation attached to it, is valuable in its own right. It gives the team a location they can return to again and again with new tools and new experimental designs, confident that they'll get some kind of measurable response, even if that response doesn't always look the same way twice. Most of the property's other anomalies don't offer that same level of dependability, which is part of why the bubble has increasingly become the season's central organizing focus rather than just one storyline among several. That's part of what makes this season's approach so notable. Rather than continuing to document the bubble passively, waiting for anomalies to occur and recording them after the fact, the team has spent this season taking an increasingly active, experimental approach, deliberately introducing new stimuli into the area and monitoring how the environment responds. The rocket experiments earlier in the season were part of that shift. The fire and heat experiments were part of it too. And this week's drone and radar deployment represents the most technologically ambitious version of that approach yet, combining aerial mobility with radar's ability to detect objects and disturbances beyond the range of ordinary cameras. When a team spends an entire season steadily escalating the sophistication of their experiments in one specific area, and then, during the most advanced version of that experimental approach so far, an unplanned sighting occurs. That's not really a coincidence in the way a single random anomaly might be. It reads more like the natural culmination of a season-long strategy, finally producing the kind of result the team had been building toward, whether or not that was the specific outcome anyone expected in advance. Now, here's where it's important to be careful and honest about the limits of what's currently known. The available coverage of this episode describes the sighting only in general terms, as a surprising development that added an unexpected twist to the drone and radar experiment. It doesn't specify whether the sighting was visual, whether it was picked up primarily by radar, whether multiple team members witnessed it directly, or what, if anything, it resembled. Outlets covering the show's schedule and general episode summaries in advance of and immediately following the air date simply haven't published that level of detail yet, and it wouldn't be responsible to fill in those blanks with invented specifics just to make this recap feel more complete. Sometimes the most accurate thing a recap can do is acknowledge exactly where the publicly available information currently stops. What we can say with confidence is this: the setup was real, the experiment was real, the location was one of the most consistently anomalous regions the show has ever investigated, and the description of a surprising, unplanned sighting occurring during that experiment comes directly from the episode's own official framing, not from speculation layered on afterward. That's a meaningfully different starting point than most shocking new mystery content, built around unverified claims or years old, recycled footage, repackaged with a new title. This is current, ongoing, and tied to an investigation that's still actively unfolding in real time as this recap is being put together. Let's think through what a moment like this could plausibly represent, weighing the same range of explanations any careful viewer of this show has learned to consider by now. There's the technical explanation, which has to be the starting point for literally every anomaly this investigation produces, no matter how compelling it initially looks. Drones and radar systems, especially when operated together in a remote, high desert environment with a documented history of electromagnetic interference, can produce unusual readings and visual artifacts that have nothing to do with anything paranormal. A radar return can be a bird, a weather balloon, an unusual atmospheric refraction, or simply a glitch in unfamiliar new equipment being pushed to its operational limits for the first time. Drone footage can catch lens flares, dust particles illuminated unexpectedly by sunlight, or compression artifacts that look far stranger on screen than whatever actually caused them in. None of this diminishes the show's overall investigation, but it's the baseline every single anomaly has to be measured against before anything more dramatic gets seriously. There's the environmental explanation, one that's specific to this particular property and has been discussed by researchers examining the ranch's history for years. If the area behind the bubble genuinely does have unusual electromagnetic or geological properties, as the team's years of accumulated data increasingly suggest, then equipment operating in that space might reasonably be expected to behave unpredictably on a fairly regular basis, without requiring any explanation beyond an unusual, still poorly understood natural phenomenon interacting with sensitive modern instrumentation. And then there's the explanation this show and its long-running audience keeps circling back to season after season, episode after episode, year after year, the possibility that whatever is happening in the bubble isn't simply a passive geological or electromagnetic quirk, but something responsive, something that reacts in ways that are difficult to predict when the team pushes new experiments into that space. Whether that responsiveness comes from something structural buried beneath the property, something tied to the older indigenous legends long associated with this land, or something the show's own investigators still don't have a name for, is exactly the question. This entire multi-year investigation has been built around answering And it's exactly the question this week's sighting adds one more data point toward without resolving it definitively either way. None of those three explanations are confirmed. All of them remain plausible to varying degrees based on what's publicly known right now. And that unresolved tension is frankly the entire reason this kind of story continues to draw an audience years into an investigation that could have quietly wrapped up long ago if it hadn't kept producing moments exactly like this one. It's worth digging a little deeper into each of these possibilities because the way they interact with each other is more interesting than treating them as three completely separate, mutually exclusive theories. Take the technical explanation first. Even if this week's sighting turns out to have a mundane technical cause, that wouldn't necessarily undermine the broader significance of the bubble as a genuine anomaly. A property with documented unusual electromagnetic properties would naturally be expected to produce more technical glitches and false positives than an ordinary stretch of land, simply because sensitive modern equipment is more likely to misbehave in an environment already known for interfering with instrumentation. In other words, even the boring explanation for this specific event doesn't actually rule as out something genuinely unusual about the underlying location. It just means this particular data point might not be the piece of evidence that finally proves it. The environmental explanation deserves a similar level of nuance. Researchers who've studied the property's geology over the years have noted unusual mineral compositions and subsurface features in certain regions, though none of that research has been conclusively tied to the specific phenomena the show documents. If the bubble's boundary genuinely correlates with some kind of geological or electromagnetic feature beneath the surface, that would represent a significant scientific finding in its own right, even without requiring anything beyond conventional physics to explain it. The challenge, and it's one the team has wrestled with for years, is that correlating instrument behavior with subsurface geology requires exactly the kind of large-scale, expensive underground surveying that a property this size and this remote doesn't always have the resources to conduct comprehensively. And the third explanation, the one tied to something responsive, something that reacts to the team's experiments rather than simply sitting passively beneath the surface, is the hardest to evaluate using conventional scientific methods, precisely because it would require an entirely different framework for detecting and confirming intentionality or responsiveness in a way that current instrumentation isn't necessarily designed to capture. That's not a reason to dismiss the possibility outright. It's a reason the team has spent years designing increasingly creative experiments, like broadcasting recorded signals back out into the world, or introducing controlled stimuli like fire, smoke, and now coordinated drone and radar sweeps, specifically in an attempt to create conditions under which a responsive phenomenon, if one genuinely exists, would have an opportunity to demonstrate that responsiveness in a way instruments could actually capture. This week's sighting sits at the intersection of all three of these possibilities, and until more detail becomes available, there's no responsible way to definitively favor one explanation over the others. What can be said is that the conditions under which the sighting occurred, a coordinated multi-instrument experiment specifically designed to detect unusual activity, represent close to the best-case scenario for capturing genuinely meaningful data, regardless of which explanation eventually turns out to be correct. It's worth taking a step back and thinking about why this specific type of story an ongoing, currently airing mystery, rather than a fully resolved one, tends to hit differently for viewers than a neatly concluded narrative would. A finished story with a clear answer at the end gives an audience closure, but it also closes the door on further engagement. There's nothing left to speculate about once every question has been answered. A story like this one, still actively unfolding, still missing key details that simply haven't been published yet, does something different. It invites the audience into the same position the investigative team is actually in, working with partial information, drawing tentative conclusions, and waiting for the next piece of data to either confirm or complicate everything gathered so far. That's genuinely closer to how real investigation work than most scripted or fully resolved mystery content ever manages to capture. Real fieldwork doesn't wrap up in tidy, hour-long increments with a clean resolution at the end of every episode. It accumulates slowly, with long stretches of inconclusive data, punctuated by occasional moments that seem to shift the picture meaningfully. Moments the investigators themselves often don't fully understand until much later, if ever. This week's sighting fits that pattern exactly. It's being treated as significant by the people who were actually there, significant enough to build an episode's narrative framing around, but not yet fully explained, described, or contextualized even by the outlets covering the show's own schedule and marketing materials. There's a broader reason this kind of live unfolding uncertainty resonates with audiences the way it does, and it has less to do with the specific subject matter of this show and more to do with how people generally relate to unresolved information in an era saturated with content that resolves itself instantly. Most media consumed today is designed to answer its own question within the runtime allotted to it. A mystery gets solved by the credits. A cliffhanger gets resolved by the next episode, often released the same day as part of a full season drop. That instant resolution is convenient, but it also trains audiences out of sitting with genuine uncertainty for extended periods of time. A story like this one asks something different of its audience. It asks viewers to accept that the most honest answer right now, this week, is simply that something happened. It was significant enough to matter to the people directly involved, and the full picture isn't available yet. That's an uncomfortable position for a lot of viewers accustomed to immediate resolution. But it's also precisely why stories like this one tend to generate such sustained engagement over time. There's a natural instinct to keep checking back, to keep watching for updates, to keep piecing together whatever new fragments of information surface in the days and weeks following an episode like this one. That ongoing engagement isn't a marketing trick. It's simply what genuine uncertainty does to curious people, whether it's happening in a television investigation or in any other unresolved situation worth caring about. It's also worth acknowledging that this kind of extended, evolving mystery format carries real risk for any production willing to commit to it honestly. A show that promises resolution and fails to deliver it eventually loses the trust of its audience. A show that's upfront about ongoing uncertainty and consistently follows through on revisiting and building upon its own unresolved threads across multiple seasons earns a different kind of trust, one based on the audience's confidence that the investigation is genuinely ongoing, rather than manufactured for dramatic effect. 7 seasons in, with threads like the bubble still actively being investigated using increasingly sophisticated methods, this show has largely maintained that second kind of trust which is part of why a moment like this week's sighting less lands with the weight that it does, rather than being dismissed as just another manufactured cliffhanger. Given all of that, here's a reasonable way to think about where this story currently stands and where it's likely to go from here. In the near term, it's reasonable to expect more detailed coverage of exactly what this sighting involved surface as more viewers watch the episode, and as recap outlets, forums, and dedicated fan communities that track this show closely begin publishing more granular breakdown of what actually appeared on screen. Shows like this one tend to generate exactly that kind of detailed secondary coverage within days to weeks of an episode airing, as viewers compare notes, timestamp specific moments, and build out shot-by-shot analyses of unusual footage. It's entirely possible that by the time a wider audience catches up with this episode, considerably more specific detail about the sighting will already be circulating. In the longer term, and this is a pattern the show has demonstrated consistently across 7 seasons now, it's likely that this week's sighting won't be treated as a standalone, isolated event. Given how deliberately the team has been escalating their experimental approach to the bubble all season, it would be consistent with the show's established pattern for this sighting to inform whatever experiment comes next. For the team to treat this unplanned data point the same way they've treated previous unexpected results as a reason to design a more targeted, more instrumented follow-up specifically aimed at reproducing or better understanding whatever just happened. This pattern of escalation, response, and further escalation has effectively become the show's core structural rhythm over its 7-season run, and it's worth spelling out because it helps set realistic expectations for what's likely to come next. A typical cycle tends to unfold something like this. The team runs an experiment based on the best available theory at the time. That experiment produces a result, sometimes conclusive, more often only partially conclusive, and occasionally, as appears to have happened this week, genuinely unexpected. The team then spends time analyzing that result, consulting with each other, and often with outside specialists, before designing a new, more targeted experiment specifically built to test whatever new hypothesis the previous result suggested. That new experiment then produces its own results, and the cycle continues. Viewed through that lens, this week's sighting isn't really an ending or a standalone revelation. It's a data point that will almost certainly shape the design of a future experiment, likely still within this same season, given how much runway remains before the year concludes. Longtime viewers of the show have seen this pattern play out repeatedly, a seemingly minor anomaly in one episode becoming the direct inspiration for an elaborate multi-instrument experiment several episodes later, once the team has had time to fully process what they observed and design a proper follow-up. That's also part of why it would be premature to treat this week's sighting as either a hoax, a mistake, or a definitively confirmed paranormal event. The show's own format essentially guarantees that this specific thread will be revisited, expanded upon, and tested further before the season concludes. Whatever conclusion eventually gets drawn, if any firm conclusion gets drawn at all, is likely still several episodes away, built on top of whatever the team learned from designing their next experiment around this week's unexpected result. That's ultimately the through line connecting this week's episode to the seasons that came before it, and probably to whatever comes after it as well. This isn't a show built around isolated, shocking moments that never connect to anything larger. It's built around a slow, methodical, occasionally frustrating accumulation of data, punctuated by moments exactly like this one. Unplanned, only partially understood in the moment, but significant enough that the team keeps building their next move around trying to understand it more fully. It's also worth thinking about this moment from the perspective of the broader audience who has followed this investigation across all 7 seasons, rather than only from the perspective of the team conducting it. For viewers who have watched the bubble evolve from a vague, loosely defined area of interest into the season's central organizing mystery, this week's sighting represents something close to a payoff for years of patient viewing. It's easy to forget, watching a single episode in isolation, just how much cumulative context long-term viewers are bringing to a moment like this one. They remember the early, inconclusive radar readings from years earlier. They remember the slow process of the team narrowing down the bubble's approximate boundaries. They remember previous seasons' experiments that produced ambiguous or ultimately unexplained results. All of that accumulated context transforms what might look to a first-time viewer like a single strange moment in a single episode into something that feels to a long-time audience like the culmination of years of patient investigation, finally producing a result significant enough to build an entire episode's framing around. That's part of why a title like the one built around this week's episode resonates the way it does. It's not overselling a minor development for the sake of a dramatic headline. It's accurately reflecting how this specific moment lands within the much larger context of an investigation that has been building toward exactly this kind of result for years. Whether the eventual full explanation turns out to be technical, environmental, or something closer to the property's oldest and most persistent legends, this week's sighting earns its place in that larger story simply by virtue of when, where, and how it occurred. During the most sophisticated experiment the team has run in this specific location, in the middle of a season explicitly built around escalating their approach to understanding it. So here's where this leaves things, at least for now, with the information currently available. A team ran a coordinated drone and radar experiment over one of the most consistently anomalous regions on a property that has been formally investigated for years. In the middle of that experiment, something unplanned happened, a sighting significant enough to reshape the framing of the entire episode, significant enough to center a recurring host's attention, and significant enough that the show's own marketing describes it as adding a genuine twist to the investigation. What exactly that sighting looked like, whether it was primarily visual, radar-based, or both, and how the team is planning to follow up on it isn't fully public yet. But given this show's track record, it's a near certainty that this won't be the last time this specific moment gets referenced, expanded on, or built into a future experiment. If your own equipment picked up something unplanned in the middle of a carefully designed test, would you want to know immediately what it was? Or would part of you rather keep collecting data first and deal with the explanation later, the way this team so consistently seems to choose, season after season, even when the uncertainty clearly weighs on them? And if a place kept producing moments like this one, season after season, year after year, never quite resolving into a single clean answer, would that keep you watching closely? The way it's kept an entire dedicated audience watching for 7 full seasons and counting now? Or would the not knowing eventually become too much to comfortably sit with for that long? That's the question this investigation keeps asking, in a slightly different form, almost every single week. This week, it's asking it again. And based on 7 seasons of precedent, it's very unlikely to be the last time this particular thread comes up before this season concludes.